So, for my background, um, I was raised Seventh day Adventist. My mother's a Seventh day Adventist. My grandparents were Seventh day Adventists. My great grandparents were Seventh day Adventist missionaries. My great great grandparents converted to Adventism. Interesting note, when my great great grandfather first went to an Adventist church, he used a chain to chain his truck to a tree because they didn't trust the Adventists not to steal his truck. My guess is he was a cool person, but unfortunately I never met him. So my first memories was being 3 years old at Strawberry Mill Daycare, Seventh Day Adventist Daycare, on the grounds of the New England Memorial Seventh Day Adventist Hospital, telling people I was 3 years old. Um, so I grew up almost entirely in Adventist schools. Went to Strawberry Mill. After that, went to Edgewood Elementary School, also Seventh Day Adventist. Um, I was out of Edgewood for 1 year in third grade, which is actually where I met a good friend. Um, his channel is The Friggin' Hiker. If you're interested in hiking in Massachusetts, you should check it out. But then back to Edgewood. After I finished Edgewood Elementary School, ended up at Greater Boston Academy. All of these schools kind of form a chain that is designed to just kind of chain people from one school to the next. Where Strawberry Mill was like kindergarten pre-K, Edgewood was kindergarten through 8th grade, Greater Boston Academy was 9th through 12th. And in my junior year at Greater Boston Academy, the New England Memorial Hospital went under. The New England Memorial, the Boston Regional Medical Center at the time. If you look up the book Last Day Events from one of the Ellen White compilations, there's a chapter in there about moving out of the cities, and there's a lot of references to a hospital in Melrose, Massachusetts. That's the same hospital we're talking about. It was the New England Sanitarium when it was first founded, and when my great-grandmother did her medical training there as a nurse, it changed names to the New England Memorial Hospital, and then ultimately the Boston Regional Medical Center. But they went bankrupt, and that the church I was going to was attached to that hospital. Literally, the buildings were connected. Historically, they actually would took some of the patients through a tunnel connecting the two buildings from the hospital to the church, so they could sit and see the church service. They didn't do that in my time. But the church and the hospital I was attending were connecting. Greater Boston Academy was built on the back half of that property. And when all of these were built in the 1960s, nobody bothered to be concerned about who owned the property. So the property and the title for the property was all in the name of the hospital. And when the hospital went under, the creditors wanted to evict the church and wanted to evict the school. And this resulted in the first bankruptcy jury trial in Massachusetts history in over 100 years. And at the time, I was a junior in high school, and I was also writing for the school newspaper, the Panther Prince, and I was a baptized member of the New England Memorial Church, which made me a member, obviously a member of the church and vote with voting rights there, but also made me a member of the constituency for the school, so I had voting rights there. And as this jury trial started, I remember very distinctly the president of the Southern New England Conference came down, and he made an argument that the church and the school needed to authorize him to make any decisions involving the trial in case there was an emergency that came up. And we did. And then immediately, I think it was either the next day or the day after, he turned around and offered to settle. So he offered basically to give up the school building, he offered to give up the church, and all for pennies. I mean, these buildings, my guess is if you had to rebuild them now, they'd probably cost you $10-15 million, maybe a little more. And he offered for like a few thousand, or a few $100,000. Either way, it was like pennies on the dollar. And there was a major, the students showed up to protest the next day at school on a Sunday. I was working at McDonald's, or Burger King at the time, and couldn't show up. But it left a very bad taste in my mouth. Because basically, I felt like he lied to me at that meeting, or lied to the whole, me and everyone else on the constituency. And it actually spawned a phrase. Used to hear a lot of the GBA students would say, what was it? It's easier for a camel to pass through the head of a needle than for a conference official to enter the kingdom of heaven. Yeah, if you're Adventist, you know where that's from. Or really, if you read your Bible. So, actually, that was my sophomore year at Greater Boston Academy. Junior year, Greater Boston Academy continued, but changed locations. We were meeting in the bottom floor of Edgewood. And I had some problems with one of the teachers there. I thought the teacher was incompetent, and I didn't like how he was treating some students. So he and I didn't get along very well. And at the end of the year, there was a break-in at the school. Some stuff was... I don't know if anything was actually stolen. There might have been something stolen. This is almost 20 years ago now. Actually, it is 20 years ago. So my memory may be a little fuzzy on this. But all of the teachers from Edgewood and GBA, except one, went to the police and said, he did it. Go arrest him. And pointed at me. And I wasn't the one who did. I ended up talking to the police a few times. One of the detectives tried to dodge talking to me. But earlier in that year, I had been to a retreat for class officers in the whole kind of northeastern U.S. and got to meet a bunch of really good students at Union Springs Academy. So as all this was going down, I was kind of already thinking about transferring out to Union Springs Academy, and the police didn't arrest me or anything, but I'm not sure GBA would have allowed me back if I had said I was coming back for my senior year. So I ended up spending my senior year at Union Springs Academy, which, by the way, is an amazing school. Back then, it's an amazing school. Now, if you've got kids anywhere really in the Americas, North America, whatever, they've got students there from Brazil, think about sending them to Union Springs Academy. It's truly a special place. It's frequently referred to itself as God's school, and that's not wrong. So if you're a parent with kids in that age group, they're a boarding school, they're awesome, think about it. But anyways, graduated Union Springs, and then went off to college at Southern to get my degree in computer science. And this would, a couple years later, still at Southern, I think I was a junior when this happened, in the run-up to the, I think 2004, run-up to George W. Bush's re-election. One of my professors told me that the Thursday convocation, kind of big assembly meetings that happened every week, the presenter had been doing research on Noah's Ark and had some really cool findings that he was going to present. So, I was planning to skip convocation and go to lunch early, but I went that week. Just because one of my professors said it was good. And I can't remember if it was Professor Urbina or Beckett, but it's one of the two. So I went. And the presenter got up, and this is the guy who's supposedly been researching Noah's Ark, and instead of telling us about Noah's Ark, he started talking about politics. And the things I distinctly remember is he told us we needed to find a family values candidate to vote for. At the time, family values was kind of a frequent buzzword. And he went on to define family values as meaning you needed to be married by the time you were 25 and you needed to have kids by the time you were 30, or you weren't starting a family. And keep in mind, this presentation is at the Collegedale SDA Church, or I don't know exactly what it's called, but it's on Southern's campus. So this is a massive Adventist church, 2,000 people in the audience. This isn't some like random hick that they brought in. He's on the pulpit of a giant church. He's kind of got a little bit of authority in theory. And this is what he's saying. And I also remember he went on to say we also need to, this guy was a little ranty, went on to say that we needed to ban guns completely. And as you'll find out watching my channel, I'm a gun owner. One of my grandfathers was a gunsmith and a collector of giant collection of Winchester rifles, one of which I still have, kind of cool. My other grandfather was a marksmanship instructor. So this guy getting up, and I was a nerdy guy at that time. I had one girlfriend in my entire life at that point. Had very, no prospects. I wasn't expecting to be married by 25 or with kids by 30. And he's talking about needing to jail people like me and ban guns, so kind of standard liberal talking points. And he's doing this from the pulpit of a giant church. And I was expecting a really good presentation, so I was sitting towards the front. And I distinctly remember standing up in front of these about 2,000 people, and attendance was tracked by these little attendance cards, paper attendance cards, put your name on, turn it in at the end. And I remember walking past these people with my attendance card and ripping it up as I walked past 2,000 people, making it very clear that, like, I wasn't getting attendance for this event, and then just chucked it into the audience. On the off chance one of the people watching this got hit by a ripped up piece of attendance card at Southern this would have been about 2004. Sorry. No offense. I shouldn't have done that and chucked it at you. I should have just dropped it on the floor. My apologies. But anyways, ripped out my attendance card, told the the Dean of Student Affairs, I think was the guy's title, some executive from the school was standing in the lobby, tried to intercept me on the way out, and I basically just told him this kind of garbage shouldn't be allowed in church. It's supposed to be a church. He should be talking about God. He shouldn't be talking about his personal politics. And there had been on campus in some of the discussions on Nilo's Place, kind of an online forum for students, student run and student moderated. There'd been a lot of controversy on politics and stuff. And at the time, the General Conference in the North American Division, I think the General Conference, were publicly posting political statements on their website, and like, the Adventist Church believes this, the Adventist Church believes this. And some students were clinging to that and being like, if you disagree with this, you're not Adventist. And the GC does political lobbying and other stuff. And I kind of concluded at that point I disagreed with the major political positions of the church, and I was done with Adventism. Now, keep in mind, I'm a junior, I think sophomore, junior, at a Seventh-day Adventist college, living there, eating there, going to the required worships and convocations. We were theoretically required to go to church. There were so many churches in the area, the way they took attendance for church was they just checked the dorm to make sure you were gone, and they assumed if you were gone, you were at church. So I spent Sabbath morning out hiking in the woods, which is actually kind of awesome. Hiking Sabbath morning school. If you get the chance, whatever. Occasionally do it. But at that point, I decided I wasn't Adventist anymore. Just kind of going through the required motions, and that was about it. So I graduated 4 years, got my degree in computer science, was one class short of a double major in computer system administration, but it was a second semester class, and I wasn't sticking around a year for that. Didn't have a job prospects lined up, so moved back in with my parents. About a week later, or 2 weeks later, I think a week later, I went back to the same church I went to as a kid. And it had relocated. The New England Memorial Church was no longer, obviously, had forced to relocate because of the bankruptcy at the hospital. And I think at that point they had merged with the Stoneham Village Church and became the Stoneham Memorial Church, which is still operating. Cool church, plenty of cool people there. If you're in the Stoneham, Massachusetts area, once again, check it out. Cool place. But I remember I'd been part of the AV team as a kid, so I was talking to the head AV, and he had some projects he wanted to do, and I had the skills to do them. It was mostly computing related, and I just went to college and learned all that stuff. And he told me that, and I told him, like, this is what equipment's needed, and he said, okay, go ahead and buy the equipment out of your own personal funds, donate it to the church, and I'll help you itemize it on your taxes. At this point, I was straight out of college, no job, very little money in the bank, living with my parents. I think this was going to cost something like $500-600 worth of equipment for the project he wanted to do. And it was really a pet project. It wasn't like a major need of the church to have this. And I didn't have $600 to donate to his project. I had $17,000 in student loans. So that was the last time I went to that church. Yeah. I can't remember whether I went once after graduating or twice, but after this project was presented that I was supposed to pay for, that was it. A couple years later, got a job, all that stuff. Ended up out on my own. And several years later, somebody mentioned camp meeting was happening. For those of you who are not familiar with it, the Southern New England Conference has what they call a camp meeting every year. It's right after school's let out. And basically it's a week-long set of religious meetings. They have nightly kind of church service things. Several times a day they have like mini Sabbath school stuff, all age groups. They've got the property they do this on, they actually have room to set up tents. And I don't know, I think at the time they were probably getting 200-300 people. When I was a kid, it was probably closer to 500 or 600 people would stay there for the entire week. But that happened, and I think my mother actually suggested going out and checking it out. And it was a 45-minute drive from where I was living at the time, so I actually started going every night, and I enjoyed it. Ironically, once I saw the GBA teacher who kind of, the major contributor to me leaving that school, or caught all the problem that made me a target. I saw him once, I said hello. He saw me freaked out and ran away. I don't know what he was expecting, but I said hello with a smile and a wave, and yeah, anyways. After that week was over, I decided I was going to go to the church that was right next to there. I don't think AUC was still Atlantic Union College. I think they had shut down at that point. But there was still a church right between the camp meeting property and the college. There was a church there. So I started attending there every Sabbath. So I'd get up early, drive an hour to church. There was a Sabbath school class in the sanctuary that I joined. And the Sabbath school class, most weeks, it consisted of, it was pretty much entirely dominated by two old men. They were probably in their 60s and 70s. No discernible family. It was just, those two guys were there on their own, for the most part. And they were arguing semantics. I mean, this is like differences between two different words that your thesaurus would say were synonyms, that these two guys would be arguing about, while being cheered on by their 90-something-year-old mothers. Kind of a little weird. Kind of gave me the impression like this isn't necessarily the group I want to be with if that's their dynamic. But I was wishing I could get a Sabbath school quarterly so I could study the lesson and know what we'd be talking about and actually join in the discussion instead of being sitting there and they're like referencing Bible verses I didn't know about and all this stuff. I was just lost. I was learning a little bit listening to the discussion, but I couldn't really participate because I hadn't studied ahead of time. And most of the time when I'd go there, the greeter says, "Hi, welcome to church," or "Hi, happy Sabbath," and then I'd go sit down, and Sabbath school happened, church happened, and I'd leave, and I pretty much wouldn't talk to anyone else, or no one would talk to me. I think one person tried to start a conversation, or had a brief conversation with me once, but that was it. And I wanted to get a quarterly, and the Adventist bookstore wasn't open hours I could get there, and the quarterlies weren't on Amazon at the time, so I couldn't really get in this quarterly. And after a couple of months of this, the new quarter started. Oh man, it's cold out here. New quarter started, and they were passing out new quarterlies. And I very distinctly remember the woman with a box of quarterlies going down the pew, and she walked to the woman who was, sitting a couple little down from the pew, and she goes, "Oh, hi, so-and-so, here's your quarterly," and recognized the woman by name, handed her quarterly, all that. Then she walked over to me, and she still got the box of quarterlies, and she looks at me, "You a member here?" And honestly, I wasn't. I had never gone through a membership transfer at all, so I was still a member of that church I had left years ago, probably almost 5 years ago at that point. So I honestly said, "No, I'm not currently a member." And she kind of looked at me, "Okay," and then just walked away. Didn't give me a quarter. Which at the time, a lot of churches, in order to save money, they had a policy of only giving out quarterlies to members. By the way, dumb policy. If your church has a policy like that, get rid of it. Seriously, if somebody shows up at your church and says, "Can I have a quarterly?" hand them a quarterly, even if you grab them your own personal quarterly that's got notes in it. If that's the only one there, hand it to them, give it to them, make sure they have a quarterly. But anyways, she's kind of just looked at me, "Oh, you're not a member? Okay," and she just walked off, and I didn't get a quarterly. That was the last time I went to that church. I hadn't, no one had talked to me, no one had really engaged with me. I wanted to be able to join in the discussion, and they didn't give me a quarterly when they were being passed out. I very much felt like I was an alien there, and I left. Life went on. Fast forward a couple years. My mother had actually suggested I check out this, I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head. It was kind of this mini mega church. They probably had several thousand members, 2 different campuses where they streamed the video from one primary church to the secondary church. Very rich. I think they were in Lexington, Massachusetts. Very rich church. Amazing production quality, fancy lighting, all that stuff. Great music. And I started attending there. And having grown up Adventist, I'm really not entirely trusting of a Southern church. So when the pastor would say stuff and reference verses, I wrote it down, and afterwards I'd actually go to a laundromat to do my laundry, and while my laundry's running, I'm reading my Bible and trying to check his references. And he was horribly inconsistent. He'd make a reference to 1 Corinthians 1 Corinthians chapter 2, that's what he said, and what he meant was 2 Chronicles chapter 1. It took me a lot of reading to try to find what he really meant, because he was horrible at citing references wrong. And they had multiple services, and my mother was attending there also, and I wanted, if I'm going to church, for it to be for me, not doing this for my mother. So I went to the early church service. She didn't know anything about it. And I was thinking about joining that church. And then the pastor got up and did a sermon about Daniel. And he was talking about the king's food. Just quick summary. Basically, Israel's conquered by Babylon. A lot of the nobility and the kind of the rich kids, supposedly smart kids from Israel, were sent off to Babylon to train to assist the administrators there. The presumption was the nobility were really smart, useful people, so we'd take their kids and let them be smart, useful people for the Babylonians. And Daniel and some of his friends were included in this, and they were offered the best choice food from the Babylonians, which included pork, which Jews don't eat, which, frankly, if you read your Bible, Christians shouldn't be eating. And Daniel had said, no, we're not going to eat this. Give us clean food, for a while. Let us try this, and then compare us to the other people who are eating the pigs and the fancy king's food. And the pastor had said the reason Daniel did this was just to get a little taste of home, to keep a little bit of home in his heart, not because God said don't eat pigs. And this was very clearly, the pastor wants his bacon in the morning. He didn't care what the Bible said. He was trying to justify liking bacon. And I know Daniel was doing what he did because God said don't eat bacon. I mean, look it up in your Bible. I'm sorry, I don't have references in front of me. It's there. I'll talk about that later, or annotate it or something. So that was the last time I went to that church. Because at that point, I saw that the pastor was more convinced with, or more interested in how Christianity made his life feel good and how he could adapt Christianity to the way he wanted to live, rather than what God actually said. So fast forward a couple of years, moved down to Texas. Job was going well. I can't remember. For some reason, I started attending the Stonehill Seventh-day Adventist Church. When I say attending, I'd show up halfway through the service, like after song service, tried to get in there, what I thought was halfway through the service, in time for offering, so I could throw $20 on the plate, hear the sermon, and then leave. And I wasn't dressing up for this. I was showing up to church in like cargo pants and a t-shirt or polo shirt or something like that. Very much trying to look like, hey, I'm not one of you. And I did that for a little while. And like as soon as the pastor said amen, I was out the back door. This actually started the week of Pastor Eugene Kitney's first sermon, before he was the official pastor there. But like his first sermon was when I started doing the sneak in the back thing. And then some stuff happened. I went on vacation in Florida. By the way, if on the off chance Ben or Cheryl or Christine happen to see this, you guys all probably know little bits and pieces of the story, but not a lot of the details. If you want to really know the details, ping me, because my guess is whatever assumptions you have about this is going to be wrong. But something went horrible. Like, I had left the church. I knew I was a sinner. The Bible says all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Every Adventist has probably, or everyone who went to an Adventist school, I'm sure, has this memorized. Even if you couldn't say where in the Bible it is there, you know that verse exists. But I always thought of myself as being a good person. You know, I went to work, I didn't cheat, I didn't steal, I paid my taxes, all that stuff. And then I did something that absolutely shattered that mindset. And I couldn't justify, I could not consider myself a good person. What I did wasn't illegal or anything, but it was destructive, it was self-destructive, it was destructive to everyone else involved. And frankly, I didn't know how to live with myself after that. Exodus, it mentions God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So we know God kind of will occasionally manipulate people. And that happened, I think, on a Monday night. And I had a rough week. I couldn't think straight. I basically was trying to reconcile what I had done with the idea that I was a good person and realized I wasn't a good person. I was a horrible person. Um, I ended up hiking around Lake Pflugerville a bunch that week, just pacing the house. Like, it was work or pace the house, walk around, like, trying to get my brain put together. Um, I honestly think the only reason I made it through that week instead of exiting was because God prevented me from realizing that that the 45 sitting on my hip was an option to just make it all my problems go away. And then somehow I made it through to Sabbath. And I went to church early, so instead of sneaking in the back halfway through the service, I actually showed up in time for Sabbath school. Walked in the front door, talked to one of the greeters, John, really cool guy, by the way. He's not currently working as a greeter, but he was amazing at it. And said, hey, can you recommend a Sabbath school class? And he turned around, pointed me to the young professional Sabbath school classroom, and it was unlike anything I've ever seen in an Adventist church before. Every Adventist church, frankly, including the church I attend now, that same church really, the focus is on the kids' Sabbath school programs from, divided by age group. They have beginners and cradle roll and primary and juniors and early teen and youth and collegiate and young adult. Basically, they've got grouped classes all the way until you graduate college. And then they've got nothing. They've got a few adult classes, and the few adult classes are pretty much populated by parents and grandparents, geriatrics. It seems like people, when they have kids, they think, hey, church was good for me as a kid, I should drag my kid there and show up too. And you also have then they disappear as empty nesters, kind of come back when they're really old, getting ready to die. The kind of geriatric Sabbath schools, it seems. But that out of college, no kids, they don't exist in churches. And at the time, Stonehill SDA Church had a young professional Sabbath school class, and I walked in, and it was people like me. It was two other single guys who were there every week. They were late 20s. I think I was in my early 30s at the time. Not sure if I was hit 30 by then, but anyways, and it was just so different. I've never seen a Sabbath school class in a church that was focused kind of for people who are done with school but don't have kids in that age gap. And I very distinctly remember after Sabbath school class had ended, Tim came up to me and he said, oh, hey, I realize you're visiting. Thanks for joining, or something like that. It's Tim. And he said, here's a quarterly. He gave me a quarterly. He went out of his way to give me a quarterly. And that it mirrored what I went through at the little South Lancaster church in Massachusetts, where they refused to give me a quarterly. And I don't think Tim has any idea how much that meant, that he offered the guy who'd visited once a quarterly. Kind of a side note, I was actually really nervous about that and didn't take it. So I took the quarterly from him and left it in the room. I took it now. There's a quarterly sitting in my Bible case. And at that point, I started going to Sabbath school class every week. That was the high point of my week, was that Sabbath school class. I'm not a fan of the music, that's just me, but the Sabbath school class, the great discussions, then the sermon later, that was the best parts of my week. Like, my week was counting down to Sabbath. And anytime there was an event on the church calendar, I went. There was volleyball night, game night, I'd be there. Not playing volleyball, I was actually playing board games and stuff like that. I've learned a couple guys you don't want to play cards with because they're really, really good. Not that we were gambling, but church work bees I showed up to. After the second church work bee, I ended up working with the pastor a bunch. And when nominating committee time came around, they ended up nominating me as a deacon. And I said, okay, I have no idea what that means, but I'll do it. Um, got to meet some good guys. Worked with the head deacon, Pete, at the time, and he kind of showed me the ropes. And I did my best to do that. Like, I showed up early, stayed late, made sure to lock things up. If they needed a deacon for something on a Sunday, generally I'd volunteered to go do that. I'd clean up the trash in the sanctuary, whatever it was. When Pete went on vacation, he needed somebody to cover for him as a backup. Okay, he asked me to do it. So I ended up as the backup head deacon for like a month while he was on vacation. He came back, and within a week or maybe it was within a month of him coming back, he basically told me he needed to step down for health reasons and he wanted me to take over. I've kind of been there since, but it shows a lot about how quickly your life can turn around when you just say, okay, God, here I am. What do you want me to do? It's like, I'll be honest, I'm absolutely incompetent as the head deacon of the church. But where I fail, God steps in. Like, there have been times where we were shorthanded and I needed a couple extra deacons for offering at a special event. I pray, God sends the... I've learned to be careful, because when I said, God, I just need help, he sent like 17, well, I'm exaggerating, he sent like 6 guys when I needed 2. So, when you pray, try to be specific, otherwise God will be like, here's way more than you need. But it really goes to show when you go to God and say, hey, I'm willing, how can I help? Use me, he will. He'll put you to work and give you awesome opportunities. But anyways, I'm getting long-winded, coming up on 40 minutes, but that's my background.